The camper thought the stakes were just some strange coincidence, until he found the third one, planted in the middle of his campsite. No footsteps, no noise, just the haunting evidence that someone was there. Each day brought him closer to understanding one thing: he wasn't meant to make it out alive. What you're about to hear is how solitude turned into a trap. It started as a search for peace in the wild, far from anyone who could help if something went wrong. Alone in the woods, even the smallest detail can take on a much darker meaning. For the camper, the promise of total isolation was exactly what he wanted. He hadn't told anyone his plans. The Oregon forest seemed like the answer, rugged, endless, and silent. He parked at a remote trailhead and set off with a loaded backpack, choosing a path not marked on most maps. The forest felt untouched, and as he hiked deeper, he left behind any sign of other people. The first hours were peaceful. Sunlight filtered through tall trees, and the only sounds were birds in the branches and the steady crunch of his boots. Soon the trail faded, and he pushed through thick underbrush until he found a clearing that felt hidden and safe. It was a small, flat patch of ground ringed by dense pines. He set his pack down and spent the next hour pitching his tent and arranging his gear. By the time he finished, the sky was streaked with gold, and the air was cooling fast. That first evening, the quiet felt like relief. He sat by a small fire, letting the silence settle around him. But as the light faded, he started to notice things he hadn't before. There was a faint, sharp sound, a single snap from somewhere in the trees. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make him pause. He told himself it was just an animal or a branch shifting as the temperature dropped. He tried to ignore it and focused on the fire. Later, zipped into his sleeping bag, he listened to the forest. There were the usual noises: leaves rustling, insects chirping. But then, that same sharp snap echoed again, this time closer. He sat up, heart pounding, and shined his flashlight out through the mesh window of the tent. All he could see were trees and shadows. Nothing moved. After a while, exhaustion won out, and he convinced himself he was overreacting. He drifted off, telling himself it was just part of being alone in the woods. Morning brought cold air and a thin mist. He crawled out of the tent, stretched, and tried to shake off the unease from the night before. Then he saw it. The ground near his sleeping bag had been disturbed. A thin wooden stake, clearly carved and sharpened, was stuck upright in the earth less than a foot from where he'd slept. He crouched down, turning it over in his hands, trying to make sense of it. It hadn't been there before. The clearing was remote, and he hadn't seen anyone. He tried to reason it away. Maybe it was left by a hiker, or a stray piece of wood he missed when setting up camp. Still, something about it felt deliberate. He tossed the stake aside and tried to move on with his day. He could have packed up and left, but he told himself there was no real danger. Nothing had happened except finding a strange piece of wood. Still, the image of the stake stayed in his mind. And as the sun set again, he found himself gathering extra firewood and checking the edges of his camp more than once. He reinforced his tent and told himself he was prepared, but the quiet felt heavier now. As the darkness returned, the sense of being alone in the forest began to shift. The illusion of solitude was starting to crack, and the unease that had crept in the night before was now impossible to ignore. Night pressed in, and the air around the campsite felt heavier than before. The camper sat close to the fire, watching the flames shrink and flare as he fed them more wood. He tried to focus on the warmth, but his mind kept circling back to the carved stake from that morning, the way it had been planted so deliberately. He listened for every sound, every shift in the wind, but the forest offered only silence and the occasional snap of a branch settling in the cool air. About an hour after settling in, A new sound cut through the quiet. This wasn't the random settling of the forest. It was a slow, deliberate crunch of leaves, each footfall measured and careful. The steps moved in a wide circle, just beyond the reach of the firelight. He tensed, gripping his flashlight, and swept the beam across the trees, searching for any sign of movement. The shadows shifted, but nothing revealed itself. His breath sounded loud in the silence, and his hands shook slightly as he scanned the darkness. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a stillness that pressed in on all sides. He stayed awake for a long time, listening for any hint that the presence was still out there. Eventually, fatigue set in. He lay down in his tent, but sleep came in short, uneasy bursts. Each time he woke, he strained to hear anything unusual, but the forest remained quiet. In the early morning light, he crawled out of his tent and immediately checked the area where the first stake had been. The one he had thrown was gone, but a new stake stood in its place, this time only a foot from the thin wall of his tent, angled toward the door. The dirt at its base was fresh, dark against the forest floor. He stared at it, then reached out and yanked it free. The wood was rough and uneven, the tip recently sharpened. He turned it over in his hands, searching for any mark or clue, but found nothing. He didn't hesitate. He decided he would leave at first light the next day. There was no more trying to explain it away. Someone had come close enough to nearly touch his tent while he slept. He spent the day on edge, checking the perimeter of his camp, keeping the fire burning high, and glancing over his shoulder whenever the wind shifted. The forest no longer felt empty. It felt watched. That night, he built his fire larger than before and sat up late, staring into the trees. The hours dragged by, and every small sound sent his heart racing. He tried to convince himself he was imagining things, but the memory of the stake and the footsteps made that impossible. He barely slept, waiting for the first sign of dawn. When the gray light finally crept through the branches, he stepped out of his tent and froze. In the center of his campsite, planted upright where he'd eaten his dinner the night before, stood a third stake. It was positioned with care, not haphazardly tossed or left by accident. This one was impossible to ignore. The line between coincidence and intent had been erased. He stared at the stake for a long moment, feeling the weight of what it meant. The pattern was clear now. Each stake had been placed closer, each one marking his presence. He realized he was no longer just a visitor in the woods. Someone else was out there, watching, and they wanted him to know it. He began to pack up, moving quickly and quietly, every muscle tense. The stakes had become a message, and he understood it was time to go. Light crept through the branches as he moved deeper into the trees, the world around him stripped of comfort. The forest, which had once promised solitude, now pressed in from all sides with a hush that swallowed every bird call. Each step forward was measured, his mind alert to the absence of sound and the unnatural stillness that had settled over everything. He listened for movement, for anything that might signal the presence of another person. But the only thing he could hear was his own breath and the crunch of leaves underfoot. He kept glancing over his shoulder, certain that someone was there. Every so often he would stop and hold his breath. That's when he heard it, a faint, deliberate step in the distance, always stopping when he did. At first he tried to dismiss it as his nerves playing tricks, but the pattern became too clear. Whoever had left the stakes was following him, careful to keep just out of sight. The silence pressed in harder, making each small sound stand out. He pushed on, ignoring the burning in his legs and the sting of branches across his arms. The forest felt like it was shifting around him, each fork in the path more confusing than the last. He tried to retrace his route, but the landscape looked different now, as if the woods themselves were working against him. He moved faster, forced by the feeling that every second mattered. The only thing that kept him going was the hope of reaching the edge of the trees and seeing the clearing where he'd left his car. When the trees finally began to thin and the gravel lot came into view, relief hit him in a wave. For a brief moment, he let himself believe he was safe. He hurried across the clearing, heart pounding, and reached for the car door. That's when he saw what waited for him. Sitting in the center of the driver's seat was a fourth stake. He stared at it, his hand frozen on the handle. The stake looked like the others, rough, freshly carved, but this one had something new. Etched along the side in uneven letters were the words, "Run faster." The message was clear, and it cut through any lingering doubt. Someone had followed him, watched his escape, and left this final warning. He slid into the seat, his hands shaking. The stake was more than just a threat. It was a reminder that he had never been alone, not for a moment. The silence, the footsteps, the stakes, they were all part of a plan to keep him off balance. He thought about going to the police, but what could he say? There were no witnesses, no evidence except the stakes themselves. The person behind this had left nothing but fear. Driving away, he realized the stakes weren't random. They were a calculated message designed to make him feel powerless. The hunter had chosen to let him go, but it was clear that outcome was never guaranteed. The sense of control he thought he had was gone, replaced by the understanding that someone else had been making the rules all along. The memory of that final message stayed with him, a quiet reminder of how easily control can slip away when someone else is determined to take it. Isolation in the wilderness can turn quickly from peaceful to dangerous, especially when you have no way to call for help and no one knows where you are. The camper's experience is a stark warning about the risks of venturing alone and the importance of staying alert to what's happening around you. When you vanish into the woods alone, the only thing separating you from danger might be your own wits. If you've survived a testing moment or know someone else's story of wilderness terror, share it in the comments below. What would you do if you found yourself alone, hunted, and forced to trust your instincts?